Welcome back to the show, folks. This is Mike Cagley, along with Larry Smith, Brad Sturdy, and we have producer Tony Cordero here as well. And we're very fortunate to have Ross Dellinger on. People listen to him on the College Football Podcast, obviously read him as well across the country. Ross, this week the CFP rankings are out and people are a little fired up. Was there anything there that fired you up or took you by surprise?
Well, to me, there was like maybe two things that were noteworthy. I think number one, obviously, was well, I should start with this. I think the 12 team format has three kind of what they would call stress points. The architects of the format kind of built it that way, and one of the stress points is obviously who gets in. Um, who's on the bubble and gets in. Another one would be who gets home field. And then a third one is who gets the first round buys. And so I think in each one of those categories, there were some noteworthy things from the rankings. Obviously, Alabama and Miami, the resume comparison between those two and Alabama getting the nod over Miami is certainly one of those stress points. So we kind of had that. We saw that there. The home field was between Ohio State and Tennessee. They gave it to Ohio State, so it looks like and those resumes are very very similar. It's just like a coin flip there. So that was interesting. And then of course the buys right now. Boise State is probably heading toward getting the last buy and not the Big 12. So those are some interesting notes. I think going into this weekend when you look at what could change. There are really only two things because the committee chair, Ward Manuel, made it very clear that the at-large teams who are not playing this weekend cannot be adjusted among one another in their order. So Miami can't leap over Alabama, and Ohio State, they can't fall behind Tennessee. So we have a lot of that set. The big thing is the ACC championship game, actually, which I'm going to be covering. I think it's the most intriguing matchup because of that, because Clemson can steal a bid and get one of the five automatic bids for the five highest ranked conference champions if they beat SMU, and that would steal a bubble team's bid. It would potentially knock SMU out or Alabama out. The committee would be left with probably going back and forth on those two resumes.
Do you think when you take a look at those two resumes, you look at SMU and you look at Alabama, if Clemson can steal this bid for the ACC, would they be more inclined for that fourth SEC team or that second ACC team? Do they take the conference as a whole into their thought process when deciding those bids?
Well, they have said before that they really don't look as much at conference strength. They also say, they leave their hat at the door and don't, because they're all representatives of a league, most of them. Brand in college football and college athletics, the brand and the logo and the colors, it's hard to avoid those things. And I think we've seen over the years they don't avoid them. And so if I'm SMU, I really feel much better if I win that conference championship game, because I would not want to be compared to Alabama. And I think Miami, it's a similar situation with Miami that Miami was in, and they compared those two, right? And you see what happens. They picked Alabama. So, if you look at them side by side, it's tough because at SMU will have an extra win, but Alabama has much worse losses, but they also have a couple of better wins. I think strength of schedule wise, Alabama is better probably by a lot. So again, if I'm SMU, I'm trying to win. I'm trying to win this game because I'm concerned if I'm being pitted against Alabama for the last spot.
When you look at this overall, there were a lot of people who were worried that the CFP would ruin the regular season. And a lot of us look at this and say this has been one of the most exciting regular seasons. And teams with even 3 losses, rightly or wrongly, are still in the hunt for the national title. Do you think this is something that has actually vaulted college football even higher than it was before?
Definitely, yeah. And I think there were only a very small group of late college football games that became somewhat irrelevant. That would have been irrelevant in a 4-team, because there was always something you were playing for, whether that's to get into a conference championship game, to get the first round bye, to get home field, again, those stress points, or to get in general. There was always something you were playing for, it felt like. So I think it has kind of heightened the November. I mean, there were a time in November, maybe mid-November, where roughly 30 to 33 teams or so were still in contention to get in the playoff. And obviously in a 4-team playoff with 2 weeks left in the regular season, you were usually left with 6 to 8 teams, at most 10. So that made it great, and certainly a lot of fun. And I do think it was beneficial for college football. And I think it's, there was a lot made of the Miami versus Alabama debate, but in a 4-team, if you look at the rankings and such in a 4-team kind of bracket right now, I guess the arguments, if you're the 12, 13 seed versus the arguments if you're the 5 or 6 are a little different, right? You've got a lot of flawed teams, the Alabamas and South Carolinas and even Miami's, that are being debated. So, but what I will say, one thing that I think the 12-team playoff doesn't really help is this weekend. I think in a 4-team playoff, this weekend ends up being basically a quarterfinal. If you looked at things, right? So the Big Ten championship, the SEC championship game certainly would be an elimination game this weekend, probably. Like the loser, the SEC championship game, will be out of a 4-team playoff, and the winner would almost certainly be in. The Big Ten would be a little different, but if Oregon would beat Penn State, Oregon would be definitely in, and Penn State would almost certainly be out. So you'd have Oregon, and you'd have, say, the SEC championship game loser, and you probably would have Notre Dame in that mix. And then the committee would be left with a very tough decision on picking the 4th seed, whether that's Penn State, the Big Ten championship game loser, or Texas, the SEC championship game loser, or even Ohio State, or SMU if they win the ACC championship game. So it would just be this weekend would be more meaningful in a 4-team. It's still got some meaning in this 12-team, because teams can obviously get these buys, and for the ACC and the Big 12, it's kind of a win or end situation. But that's the only negative that I see in the format that's happened, is the conference championship game weekend isn't kind of as important as it was in the past. And actually, I'm in the middle of writing a story about that, because a lot of coaches and a lot of administrators think that conference championship games should be eliminated in an expanded playoff. So that's about the only negative. Otherwise, it really made November incredible.
Well, that leads me to my next question. We have seen a lot of politicking going on from South Carolina, from Ole Miss, from Miami, obviously. They know they're probably not going to get in, but they had to say their piece. Do you think that saying that piece was more towards trying to push people towards expanding this to 14 or 16 teams in the future? It's not going to eliminate debate, because then we're just going to go around to having the debate is who's in, is it 16 or 17, right?
Right. A lot of people don't understand right now what the future of the CFP and how it works. So I'll explain it really quickly. There's 2 more years left in the current deal, this year, next year, and so it'll stay the same. But starting in 2026, there's a new 6-year deal that they agreed on in the spring, along with as part of that deal, they agreed with some guarantees that the format would have to have. One of them is the 5 highest ranked conference champions get in, like they do now, and the other one is Notre Dame would get an at-large berth automatically if they're within the top 12 or top 14, depending on if they expand. And the third thing is the expansion. It would be 12 or 14 teams. And so everything else is kind of up for debate. You hear the Big Ten specifically been pushing for multiple AQs per conferences, as many as 4 for the SEC and the Big Ten, and then the ACC and the Big 12 might get a couple. The group of 5 would get 1, and then you'd be left with 3, at large berths, I believe. You take some of the decision out of the selection committee's hands. So I think we're probably headed towards something like that. If I had to guess, we may be headed toward that. But I almost certainly, it feels like we're going to have an expansion, whether that's to 14 or 16. It does feel like that's coming.
If you had to put your money on it now, is there any team there? Do you really think that Oregon is a cut above everybody else, or do you think there's a tier of 3 or 4 teams that look like contenders for the title?
Yeah. Somebody mentioned this in one of my colleagues in the media mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, and it was, for the first time in years, we go into like the last regular season game, because this was last week. I think he mentioned this. We go into the last regular season game without really knowing for sure who the favorite is to win the national championship. And I think that's a good thing for college football. And I think it probably speaks to the age of the transfer portal in NIL, leveling the playing field, not for everybody, but for the top 20, 30, 40 programs in the country. And I think we've seen that. I think we've seen, especially the portal, in the movement of players who are no longer maybe sitting the bench, right, at some of these big programs, or playing at some of these smaller programs, right? They're moving up and down in their spread, especially at the quarterback level. I mean, think about it. Oregon probably isn't here without the transfer quarterback. Texas, transfer quarterback, right? Notre Dame, transfer quarterback. Ohio State, transfer quarterback. So that's in Indiana, transfer quarterback. So, more than half of the playoff field has a transfer quarterback who's done really, really well. And that I think has leveled things off and has created a little bit of parity.
Taking a look at that parity and at those teams, is it key? Do you think this week was recruiting and signing day? Has the portal become just as important as your high school recruiting, or has it even overtaken that high school recruiting if you want to get to this place in the season?
Yeah, it's a weird time, as it's signing day, and signing day hasn't felt like signing day for a few years now. It falls just right in the middle of all this craziness of the coaching cycle and the playoffs and championship games. It is shifting the recruitment. Part of that reason is I think the recruitment is shifting toward the portal, and I think the group of 5 and the lower level power conferences, are being treated in a lot of ways as farm systems for the top 30 and 40 programs. And I don't necessarily expect that to stop. In the new era of revenue share coming in July, I think that based on how schools may write contracts, you may have a little bit of a more limited movement. But I still think you'll have movement. But I do think it'll be a little more limited in the portal, and you might start seeing a little more of high school recruitment. And I say that for 2 reasons. One, I think you're going to have built-in buyouts and contracts for players like you do coaches. The big question is, will schools enforce them, and will they have success enforcing them? And number 2, everybody's now, there's been a lot of struggle right now from NIL collectives in raising money at certain levels, and they're basically getting outbid by other schools. And now you'll have, for the most part, in the top probably 30 programs in the country, you'll have everybody paying close to the same, since it could come directly from the school. So you won't have as much of a difference. So I think for those reasons, we'll see a little more limitation in the movement.
Do you think it's ironic that some of these coaches who were so against NIL now get to keep their job because the athletic director doesn't want to go hat in hand to the boosters and say, hey, I know we need money for this recruit, but I hired poorly, and now we need some money to buy out this coach. You see any sense of irony there, or was that something that you saw coming?
Yeah, I think that the business kind of sort of dynamics, go, college athletics is in I like to say is in this kind of evolution of going from amateur to professionalized. And I think part of that is operating college athletics as more of a business. And that means making these business decisions. And outside of football and maybe some men's basketball, every other sport loses money. And so I think their school administrators are trying to save money any way they can. And I think one of the things we're going to start seeing is coaching the coaching decisions, and maybe a different approach to coaching decisions. And I think that I think what you'll see is less schools, right, paying these big buyouts. And I think what you'll see maybe in new coaching contracts like this year is smaller numbers of buyouts in years and less guarantees because of this huge number with athlete revenue sharing that exists.
Well, Ross, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a great conversation. We could go on for hours. This has been a great conversation. Really appreciate you taking time. Tell our listeners where they can follow you and where they can read your stuff in the coming days as we head towards the playoff.
Yeah, you can follow me certainly on social media, on Twitter at Ross Dellinger, and read me at Yahoo Sports.
Perfect. Thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the games this weekend.
Thanks, guys.
We'll be back with more right after a break.